What is up guys, welcome back to another GeekaWhat video, and today I've got a super special build for you. I promise that's the last of the puns. I'm going to be building live right here a $1,500 gaming PC build that is crammed full of brand new hardware, and I'm not just talking about the graphics card. We're going to see how it looks, see how it performs, and I'm going to guide you through the process, I suppose step by step. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. As with pretty much any gaming PC build, we're going to start off with the CPU and with the motherboard. I opted for this build to go the Intel route, as on the slightly higher end systems, I do find it to be a better option. The single threaded performance particularly is what sets this chip apart. A base clock speed of 3.7 GHz is pretty decent, but the boost of 4.6 is frankly outstanding, and it's going to mean even the latest games that aren't fully optimized to use a load of threads are going to love this chip. We've also got 6 cores and 12 threads as well, which means multi-threaded performance is covered. A bit of video editing or streaming is more than possible. You don't just have to game on this chip. In terms of the motherboard I selected, this is the MSI MPG Z390 Gaming Edge AC. Now I do think MSI need to streamline their naming process slightly, but the best way to look at this motherboard is actually take it out of the box and run through its feature set. Aside from the obvious fact that it looks fantastic with that blacked out aesthetic, it's crammed full of features, from multi-GPU support for more than one fast M.2 SSD, dual channel memory, support for CPU and RAM overclocking for even more free performance, with beefy enough heatsinks that you can actually get some overclocking on it if you'd like to, as well as even little stuff like reinforced GPU brackets that stop your graphics card from sagging. Now it's at this stage I'd recommend grabbing that motherboard box again, as we're going to use it as just a little bit of a work surface, as an anti-static work surface I suppose, to install our CPU. Installing the CPU is easy. You simply need to lift up the retention arm on that Intel LJ1151 socket and take the CPU out of the box. All you've then got to do is got to line up the golden triangle on the CPU with the triangle on the socket and slot the CPU into place. It shouldn't require any force or pressure to get it in, and it should just sit quite nicely. Next up, we're going to bring down that retention bracket, and that protective cover is going to pop off. You shouldn't need to take this off manually. It is going to require a bit of pressure, just don't force it as a general rule of thumb. Now the next component that we want to install while our motherboard is out in the open and easy to access is this, our M.2 SSD drive, and this particular drive is really exciting. Right now, as I'm touching and feeling this isn't even out yet, but by the time this video goes up, I'll leave this and all the other components linked in the description below for different regions and retailers. You can also get the latest pricing as well there. This is ADATA's brand new XPG Spectrix S40G. This is the world's first RGB M.2 SSD, initially launched and released at Computex of this year. As you can see from the close-up footage, it's a really nicely designed drive, and I actually can't wait to see this with the RGB on, as I haven't even seen that yet. You want to grab this really tiny bag of screws that MSI should really pre-screw in from the motherboard box, as this is going to install our M.2 drive. This is the smallest screw in history. Ugh. Installing an M.2 drive is super duper easy. You need to slide it in at a little bit of an angle and then secure it down with the screw. And that really is all there is to it. The next thing that we're going to want to grab is our memory. This also comes from the guys at XPG by ADATA, and it's their brand new Spectrix D60G. This 3000 MHz kit is going to be nice and quick, though Intel CPUs aren't quite so fussed about fast memory as their AMD counterparts. All you need to do to install memory is to pull back the retention clips on those RAM DIMM sockets. If you're unsure of which one to use, just consult the motherboard manual, as it will tell you. It's then a simple case of lining up the notch on the memory DIMM with the memory DIMM slot and applying even pressure to both sides of that RAM DIMM. It will provide a nice satisfying click, and all you've got to do is repeat for that second RAM DIMM. And just like that, that really is all there is to it. Which brings us nicely on to our CPU cooler. Now this here is Cooler Master's brand new Master Liquid ML240p Mirage. And you can see what I'm saying now about having so many brand new components. This build really is on the cutting edge of tech and isn't going to be out of date anytime soon. What makes this exciting is that it shares all the great features of their previous ML240R, which I reviewed in the card section here. The difference is you can actually see the inner workings of the pump. You get liquid flowing around that water block, creating a central piece for your system, and it's gonna look fantastic. Now obviously we can't go ahead and install the whole thing just yet, but we can get the CPU area ready, put the mounting hardware in place to make our job in the case a lot easier. It's also a great time to take out all the fans. I mean, is that plastic really necessary? I know every brand does it, it's not a Cooler Master thing, but you know, with the environment, it does seem a bit wasteful, but you get the gist. Now, Cooler Master actually have organised everything for us into a nice little box, which makes our life a little bit easier. You want to take out the manual, and you want to do this when you install any CPU cooler, as it is a complicated process that varies on a CPU, I told you it's complicated, on a CPU to CPU basis. Now it's easy to be overwhelmed by the amount of stuff you get included with CPU coolers, but don't. You aren't going to use a lot of it, as there has to be enough hardware to mount this on 3 or 4 different types of CPUs and CPU sockets. Now, thankfully, Cooler Master do a pretty good job of making this process as simple as possible. It's going to consist of 2 main stages. The first is mounting, as I am here, the appropriate hardware to the CPU water block that goes on top of the processor, and the second is the backplate assembly, which goes behind and through the motherboard, and it's going to clamp the motherboard, processor and the CPU water cooler all nicely together. Bam, bam, ba, 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 ba. Now, the next component we're going to be taking a look at today, if you hadn't already guessed, is the case. This is the Cooler Master Silencie S600, and is one of their brand new silent optimized chassis from the Silencie lineup that they've reinvigorated from a few years ago. This particular model has got a tempered glass side panel, which we're going to take off. God, that's heavy. As well as a just ridiculously thick rear panel that's crammed full of sound dampening material. We're also going to be removing this, and this is a key part in keeping, oh my God, that's so heavy, in keeping this case as quiet as possible. Now, the final couple of things to note about this case's silent credentials include this opening door, which is crammed with sound deadening foam, and then this little insert at the top that you can remove if you put fans up there, which is also got loads of like sort of soft foamy material to keep the case as quiet, as I said, as possible. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is take out the optical drive from the front as well. We're not going to need this. I think this is designed for like continental Europe, where apparently the optical drive's still a thing. The next step in today's build is to install the motherboard into the case. First though, we need to take the I/O shield from the motherboard box, which creates the link between the motherboard's rear ports and the case's back panel. You want to install this before the motherboard, otherwise that is a very time-consuming mistake. Installing it is super easy, and it just clicks in each 4 of the corners. And just like that, it is now in place. The next thing we want to do is make sure we've got standoffs in all the necessary holes, and if not, install some more. Now, pretty usefully, this case has already got all the ATX standoffs pre-installed, which allows us to slide our motherboard in and screw it down with the screws found in the bag included with the chassis. Now with the motherboard installed, it's a great time to pop in our CPU cooler. Now in order to do this, we first want to secure the radiator and fans at the front of the case and then focus on the CPU water block. Now the only really complicated bit that people tend to get wrong about installing a custom AIO cooler is applying thermal paste. This creates the conductive layer between your CPU and the metal of your CPU's cooler, so it's important that you get it right. All you need to do is syringe about the size of a large grain of rice, and that's going to do the job just fine. Just because they give you a whole tube doesn't mean you need to use it. It's intended for installing or reinstalling or frankly cocking it up 2 or 3 times. Now that our CPU cooler is installed and we're on the subject of cooling, it allows me to introduce you to this. Now this also has a 360mm counterpart and is basically an array of addressable RGB fans that are all attached together. Now, James, what is the point in that? Well, the cool thing about this is that it uses one fan and one RGB cable, regardless of how many fans you've got there, which keeps your cable management to a minimum, and RGB fans can cause a real problem in that respect. Get off, thank you. Inside the box you'll find the fan array with 2 nicely lengthed cables, a 4-pin RGB and a 4-pin PWM fan header. You also get a really simple addressable RGB controller as well, which means these work with any system configuration. Now before we install our power supply, I've got one more product from Cooler Master that I want to show you. I used this in one of my most recent builds that you can check out in the cards here, and they went down really well. They're universal PSU cable extensions. They're pretty inexpensive, work with any power supply, and are going to level up our build's aesthetics by no end. We also want to take this opportunity to install some of our fiddly front panel connectors, which I'm sorry guys, you are going to have to refer to the manual for, especially before our graphics card goes in, which I'm really excited about. Now with some of our cables ran, it's time to deal with the rest of them before finally we pop our GPU into place. For the power supply, I opted for this. It's a fully modular 650 watt unit from Cooler Master. Now, you may want to go 750 watts or even 800 watts, but with this build's estimated power consumption at load, hovering around that 420 watt mark, this should be more than enough, especially with its 80+ gold certification, which is one of the highest power supply efficiency ratings on the market. Now with the system really starting to come together, it's time for the pièce de résistance. This is the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2070 Super. Now I've actually done a review of this brand new card right here, and you can check out that full video in the card section here. It's a 4K beast and basically gives you RTX 2080 performance for the same price as an RTX 2070, and that's a real winner. This particular card is NVIDIA's Founders Edition, and what that means is you get NVIDIA's fancy cooler on here at a really great price point. I'll leave a link to this directly from NVIDIA in the description below, but if you can't find the Founders Edition, a card from Asus, MSI or GeekaWhat will surely suffice. Now this 2070 Super card gives you all the features of NVIDIA's latest graphics cards, from real-time ray tracing, which makes light in games so much more immersive, to an onboard H.265 encoder, great for video editors and those wanting to record or stream gameplay with a very minimal performance hit. With that being said though, it's time for me to cable manage, turn this PC on and then jump into some live gaming benchmarks. But first, it's montage time. For the next portion of today's video, let's find out just how well this system performs. The current gameplay on your screen now is Battlefield 5, recorded directly off this system, 1440p high to ultra settings, with crucially ray tracing and DLSS enabled. The benchmarking section of these videos is what I'm looking to improve the most, so let me know what you think for future videos. In terms of Project Cars 2, that's another title where at 4K this time it looks fantastic and is sustaining over 70-80 frames per second consistently. Now I know what you're thinking, James, what about the other titles, CSGO, Forza and Call of Duty's Black Ops 4? Well, those titles are also going to work really well. We're seeing 4K high settings consistently with either 60 FPS in the latest AAA titles or in excess of 100 or 150 in slightly older games such as League of Legends. But that, I think, just about wraps it up for today's video. If you did enjoy it, you know what to do. A big old like rating, get subscribed and ding dong that notification bell. Hit me up on Instagram, it's at GeekaWhat. But as always, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.